The morning sun barely pierced through the tall windows of courtroom 12. The room buzzed with the usual activity, attorneys shuffling papers, clerks typing away, and family members shifting nervously in the hard wooden benches. But today would prove different from any other day in Judge Richard Hoffman's 20-year career on the bench. At 57, Judge Hoffman ruled his courtroom with an iron fist and a sharp tongue. His reputation preceded him, defendants feared appearing before him, and even seasoned attorneys approached his bench with caution. The judge's salt and pepper hair and permanent scowl had become infamous throughout the county courthouse. That day, the docket included a property dispute case. The plaintiff, a wealthy real estate developer, sat confidently beside his expensive attorney. They exchanged knowing smiles, having appeared before Judge Hoffman many times before. The developer wanted to force a small business owner out of a building he had recently acquired, claiming lease violations. The defendant walked in alone. He wore a simple but neat navy blue suit that had seen better days. Thomas Johnson, a 35-year-old black man who owned a community bookstore, carried only a worn leather portfolio. No attorney accompanied him. The courtroom fell silent as he made his way to the defendant's table, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. "Representing yourself today, Mr. Johnson?" Judge Hoffman asked, peering down from his bench with raised eyebrows. "Yes, Your Honor," Thomas replied, his voice steady and clear. The judge smirked. "Bold choice. I assume you couldn't afford proper legal representation?" A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The plaintiff's attorney didn't bother hiding his smile. "I believe I understand the law regarding this matter well enough to represent myself, Your Honor," Thomas responded, maintaining eye contact with the judge. Judge Hoffman's smirk deepened. "Well then, let's see how well your self-study serves you today." He gestured toward the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Peterson, you may proceed with your opening statement." The plaintiff's attorney rose smoothly, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. For nearly 15 minutes, he outlined the alleged lease violations, speaking in legal jargon and citing numerous precedents. He presented documents showing late rent payments and claimed the bookstore had modified the interior structure without permission, violating the terms of the lease. Throughout the presentation, Judge Hoffman nodded approvingly, occasionally glancing at Thomas with apparent amusement. When the attorney finished, the judge turned to Thomas. "Mr. Johnson, your response." "Keep it brief, the court has a full docket today." Thomas stood calmly. "Thank you, Your Honor." He opened his portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "I'll be direct. The plaintiff's claims rest entirely on the terms of a lease that no longer governs our agreement." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. "Explain yourself." 3 years ago, after a pipe burst in the building, damaging my inventory, the previous owner and I negotiated a new agreement." Thomas pulled out another document. This addendum, signed by both parties, superseded several clauses in the original lease, including those regarding structural modifications and payment schedules. The plaintiff's attorney jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, we have no record of this document. This is clearly a fabrication." Judge Hoffman held out his hand. "Let me see this alleged addendum." Thomas approached the bench and handed over the document. The judge studied it for a moment, his expression gradually changing from dismissive to curious. "This appears to be properly executed," Judge Hoffman admitted reluctantly. "Mr. Peterson, did your client perform due diligence when purchasing this property?" The plaintiff's attorney stammered. "Of course, Your Honor, but you missed this rather significant document?" The judge cut him off. "Proceed, Mr. Johnson." Thomas returned to his table. "Furthermore, Your Honor, I have documentation proving every payment was made according to the revised schedule." He retrieved a folder from his portfolio. "And regarding the structural modifications, the addendum explicitly granted permission for reasonable alterations to accommodate community events." The bookshelves I installed are movable, creating an open space for the free children's reading program we host twice weekly. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Hoffman silenced it with a sharp glance. Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength. I'd also like to draw the court's attention to Section 83.56 of the State Property Code, which requires written notice of alleged violations and a reasonable opportunity to cure them before eviction proceedings can commence. He pulled out another document. I never received such notice, making these proceedings premature at best, and at worst, a violation of due process. The courtroom fell silent. The plaintiff's attorney whispered urgently to his client, whose confident demeanor had visibly faltered. Judge Hoffman studied Thomas with new eyes, no trace of his earlier condescension. Mr. Johnson, where did you acquire your understanding of property law? I spent 3 months in the law library after receiving the eviction notice, Your Honor. My bookstore is also my home. I couldn't afford to lose it without a fight. Thomas paused. Additionally, I completed 2 years of law school before financial constraints forced me to leave. The law has always interested me. The judge nodded slowly, a flicker of respect crossing his face. Mr. Peterson, Judge Hoffman turned to the plaintiff's attorney, do you have a response to Mr. Johnson's assertions regarding the addendum and the notice requirement? The expensive attorney cleared his throat awkwardly. We would need time to verify the authenticity of this addendum, Your Honor. I see. The judge tapped his fingers on the bench thoughtfully. And the notice requirement? Well, Your Honor, we believe that. It's a simple question, Counselor. Did your client provide written notice as required by statute? The attorney's silence answered the question. Judge Hoffman straightened in his chair. In light of the evidence presented, I'm issuing a continuance to allow the plaintiff time to review the addendum. However, he fixed the plaintiff with a stern look, I'm inclined to dismiss this case if it's found that statutory notice requirements weren't followed. He turned to Thomas. Mr. Johnson, while your knowledge of the law is impressive, these matters can get complicated. Have you considered seeking professional legal counsel? I have, Your Honor, Thomas replied. But good lawyers are expensive, and this bookstore supports not just me but community programs for neighborhood children. Every dollar counts. The judge studied him for a long moment. The courtroom remained silent, everyone watching this unexpected exchange. Very well, Judge Hoffman finally said. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks. And Mr. Peterson, he added, looking at the plaintiff's attorney, I suggest you come better prepared next time. As the next case was called, Thomas gathered his documents. Several people in the courtroom nodded respectfully as he passed. Outside in the hallway, a young law student approached him. That was incredible, she said. Would you consider letting me help research your case? Pro bono, of course. I could learn so much from you. Thomas smiled, surprised. I'd appreciate that. The bookstore is open until 8 most evenings if you'd like to stop by. As he walked down the courthouse steps into the bright afternoon sunlight, Thomas knew the battle wasn't over. But for the first time since receiving the eviction notice, he felt a glimmer of hope. Sometimes, justice just needed a fighting chance. Word about what happened in courtroom 12 spread quickly through the courthouse. By the following day, Thomas Johnson's stand against the wealthy developer had become something of a legend among the courthouse regulars. Court clerks whispered about it during coffee breaks, and even a few attorneys nodded in acknowledgement when Thomas returned to the law library the next morning. Thomas didn't notice the attention. He was too focused on the work ahead. The 2-week continuance gave him precious time, but he knew the developer wouldn't back down easily. People with money rarely did, especially when they wanted something. The young law student, Ava Chen, proved to be a valuable ally. She arrived at the bookstore that very evening, arms loaded with legal textbooks and a laptop. These developers have been buying up half the neighborhood, she explained as they cleared space on a table near the back of the store. They did the same thing in the West District last year, forced out all the small businesses, then built luxury condos. Thomas nodded, arranging his notes. I suspected as much. They offered to buy me out 6 months ago, but the price wouldn't even cover relocating the store, let alone finding another place to live. The bookstore itself was a testament to Thomas's life work. Shelves lined the walls, filled with carefully curated titles. A children's corner featured colorful cushions and low tables where neighborhood kids gathered for reading sessions. Community flyers covered a bulletin board near the entrance, advertising everything from local job openings to free health screenings. This place is more than just a business, Ava observed, looking around. It's a community center. That's why I can't lose it, Thomas replied simply. They worked late into the night, researching similar cases and strengthening Thomas's defense. Ava had access to legal databases through her law school, giving them insights into Judge Hoffman's previous rulings. He actually tends to follow the letter of the law, she noted, scrolling through case histories. His rudeness masks a surprisingly strict adherence to proper procedure. Thomas smiled slightly. That works in our favor then. The developers team definitely jumped the gun on filing. The next day, Thomas received an unexpected visitor at the bookstore. A middle-aged woman in a tailored suit browsed the shelves for nearly an hour before approaching the counter. Mr. Johnson? I'm Patricia Winters, clerk for Judge Hoffman. She spoke quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else could hear. I probably shouldn't be here, but I wanted you to know something. Thomas set aside the book he'd been pricing. What's that? The plaintiff's attorney has been calling the judge's chambers repeatedly, trying to get a private meeting. The judge refused. She gave a small smile. That's not his usual response to attorneys from big firms. Thomas maintained a neutral expression. I appreciate the information. Patricia nodded. Judge Hoffman has, well, he has his flaws. But seeing you stand up like that, it made an impression. Just thought you should know. She selected a mystery novel from a nearby display. I'll take this one, please. After she left, Thomas stood motionless behind the counter. It was the first sign that perhaps the system, so often stacked against people like him, might actually work as intended this time. That evening, as Thomas locked up the store, he noticed a sleek black car parked across the street. The developer himself, Harold Wilson, stepped out. Mr. Johnson, he called, approaching with the confident stride of someone unaccustomed to hearing, no, I think we need to talk. Thomas stood firmly in his doorway, keys in hand. He had expected this. When legal intimidation failed, people with money typically tried to handle things privately. I believe all communication should go through the court now, Thomas replied calmly. Wilson's smile didn't reach his eyes. I think you'll find my new offer very generous. Enough to start fresh somewhere else, with no legal headaches. And what about my customers? The children who come here? The community? Thomas asked. The developer shrugged. Business is business. Progress requires change. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. I'll see you in court, Mr. Wilson. Thomas barely slept that night. Wilson's visit had left him unsettled. The developer's generous offer had been substantially higher than his previous one, enough money to potentially find another location and stay afloat for a year. For a moment, Thomas had been tempted. Fighting was exhausting, and the outcome remained uncertain. But as he prepared coffee in the tiny apartment above his bookstore the next morning, he heard the familiar sounds of the neighborhood waking up. Mrs. Diaz opening her bakery next door. The school bus stopping at the corner to pick up children, some of whom waved up at his window. This wasn't just about a business or even a home. It was about preserving a piece of the community. Any updates? Ava asked when she arrived that afternoon, setting her backpack on the counter. Thomas poured her a cup of coffee. Wilson came by last night. Offered to buy me out. How much? He named the figure. Ava's eyes widened. That's a lot more than before. It is, Thomas agreed. But it still doesn't solve the real problem. Once I'm gone, there's nothing stopping them from pricing everyone else out too. They spent the afternoon strategizing. Ava had discovered that Wilson Development had a pattern of acquiring properties, evicting tenants on technicalities, then flipping the buildings for luxury developments. They'd been sued twice before, but both cases had been settled privately. We need to make sure this one can't be swept under the rug, Ava said. Make it public enough that a quiet settlement isn't an option. Thomas nodded slowly. The community should know what's happening. That evening, they hosted an emergency meeting at the bookstore. Thomas invited the other small business owners from the block, local residents, and even the reporter from the neighborhood newsletter. He explained the situation simply, without dramatics. The facts spoke for themselves. They're not just coming for my store, he concluded. This is about changing the entire neighborhood. Mrs. Diaz from the bakery stood up. My lease is up for renewal next month. Are you saying they own my building now too? Thomas nodded grimly. According to property records, Wilson Development has acquired most of this block. The meeting lasted for hours. People shared stories, expressed fears, and eventually, began planning. By closing time, they had formed a neighborhood association and started a social media campaign. The hashtag #SaveOurBlock began gaining traction online. As everyone filed out, an elderly man who had sat quietly in the back approached Thomas. You know, he said, leaning on his cane, I've lived here for 67 years. Seen this neighborhood change many times. He looked around the bookstore thoughtfully. But this place, what you've built here, it matters. Don't let them take it. Thomas nodded, throat tight with emotion. I won't, Mr. Taylor. That's a promise. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Thomas received an email from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, Evidence you need. Inside was a single PDF attachment. When he opened it, Thomas almost dropped his phone. It contained internal communications from Wilson Development, including emails discussing their strategy to expedite tenant removal through technical violations, and specifically targeting Thomas's bookstore as the heart of local resistance. The sender had left no name, just a brief message, use this wisely. Not everyone at the company agrees with Wilson's methods. Thomas forwarded the email to Ava immediately. This wasn't just about saving his store anymore. This was about fighting a systematic attempt to erase their community. The day before the scheduled court appearance, Thomas's bookstore was busier than it had been in years. Community members dropped by to show support, bringing homemade food and offers of help. Local artists had painted a mural on the temporary boards covering a neighboring vacant storefront, "Community Not Commodities," written in bold, colorful letters. Thomas and Ava worked late into the night, refining their strategy. The leaked emails had given them valuable ammunition, but they needed to use it carefully. We can't just ambush them with this in court, Ava cautioned. Judge Hoffman is a stickler for procedure. Evidence needs to be properly submitted. Thomas nodded. I've already filed the necessary motions to introduce the new evidence. The question is, will the judge allow it? A soft knock interrupted them. Thomas opened the door to find Patricia Winters, Judge Hoffman's clerk, standing outside. I'm sorry to come by so late, she said, stepping inside. But there's something you should know. She lowered her voice. Wilson's attorney had an ex parte communication with Judge Hoffman today. Thomas frowned. That's improper. Yes, Patricia agreed. The judge shut it down immediately, but, well, Judge Hoffman has known Wilson's family for years. They belong to the same country club. Thomas felt his heart sink. So he's biased. I didn't say that, Patricia replied carefully. What I will say is that the judge was very disturbed by the attempt to influence him. He's been reviewing your case file all afternoon. She headed toward the door. That's all I can tell you. Good luck tomorrow. After she left, Ava placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. This could work in our favor. If Wilson's team is getting desperate enough to try improper communications. They know they're on shaky legal ground, Thomas finished. But we still need to be perfect tomorrow. No mistakes. The following morning, Thomas arrived at the courthouse early. He wore the same navy suit, freshly pressed. The courtroom was already packed, word had spread about the case, and community members filled the benches. Mrs. Diaz gave him a thumbs up from the second row. Wilson sat at the plaintiff's table with not one but 3 attorneys. They spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing Thomas's way. Their confidence seemed diminished compared to the first hearing. When Judge Hoffman entered, the room fell silent. His expression was unreadable as he took his seat and surveyed the crowded courtroom. I see we have quite an audience today, he remarked. Let me remind everyone that this is a court of law, not a public forum. Disruptions will not be tolerated. His gaze lingered on the community members before shifting to the plaintiff's table. Mr. Peterson, are you ready to proceed? Wilson's attorney stood. Yes, Your Honor. However, before we begin, we'd like to request a private conference in your chambers. We believe this matter might be resolved without taking up the court's valuable time. Judge Hoffman's eyebrows rose. Mr. Johnson, do you wish to participate in such a conference? Thomas rose, straightening his shoulders. No, Your Honor. I believe this matter should be heard in open court, with full transparency. He paused. Additionally, I've filed a motion to introduce new evidence that I believe is crucial to this case. The judge studied Thomas thoughtfully. Motion granted. This hearing will proceed as scheduled. He turned a cold gaze toward Wilson's attorney. And Mr. Peterson, in the future, all communications with this court will take place on the record. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor, the attorney replied, his face reddening. Thomas took a deep breath. The real battle was about to begin. Judge Hoffman gestured to Wilson's attorney. You may begin your arguments, Mr. Peterson. Peterson seemed flustered by the judge's refusal to move to chambers. He shuffled his papers, clearing his throat. Your Honor, despite Mr. Johnson's claims at our last hearing, our client has thoroughly reviewed all documentation related to the property purchase. We found no valid addendum to the original lease. Thomas remained calm, making notes as Peterson spoke. Furthermore, Peterson continued, while we acknowledge that formal written notice might not have been provided as specified by statute, verbal notifications were given on multiple occasions. Mr. Wilson personally visited the property to discuss violations. Judge Hoffman interrupted. Verbal notifications? The statute clearly requires written notice. Yes, Your Honor, but the spirit of the law. The law is not about spirit, Mr. Peterson. It's about procedure. The judge's tone was sharp. Continue. Peterson's argument grew increasingly technical, citing obscure property law precedents. When he finally concluded, Judge Hoffman turned to Thomas. Mr. Johnson, your response. Thomas stood, buttoning his jacket. Thank you, Your Honor. First, regarding the addendum's validity, I'd like to submit this notarized copy, complete with the signature of the previous owner. He handed the document to the court clerk. The county recorder's office has a matching copy on file, which the plaintiff's team would have discovered had they conducted proper due diligence. The judge examined the document carefully before nodding. This appears to be in order. Second, Thomas continued, I'd like to address the matter of written notice. State law doesn't merely suggest written notice as a courtesy, it mandates it as a protection for tenants. Without it, landlords could claim verbal conversations that never happened. He paused, then added, regarding Mr. Wilson's visits, I have security camera footage showing that before this eviction proceeding, he visited only once, to offer to buy the property, not to discuss violations. A murmur went through the courtroom. Finally, Your Honor, I'd like to introduce evidence that suggests this eviction attempt is part of a coordinated strategy to remove small businesses from the neighborhood. Thomas submitted the leaked emails, explaining their source without naming names. As Judge Hoffman reviewed them, Wilson leaned forward and whispered furiously to his attorneys. Peterson stood quickly. Your Honor, we object to the introduction of these documents. They were obtained illegally and without proper discovery. They were sent to me anonymously, Thomas countered. I had no part in how they were obtained. The judge considered this. I'll allow them for now, though I'll consider their provenance when weighing their significance. Thomas then handed the judge another document. This is a petition signed by over 200 neighborhood residents opposing Wilson Development's attempts to displace local businesses. While I understand community sentiment isn't a legal argument, it demonstrates the real-world impact of this case. The judge accepted the petition with a thoughtful expression. Your Honor, Thomas said, his voice firm but respectful, this case isn't just about lease technicalities. It's about whether our legal system protects only those with money and power, or whether it also protects communities and the people who build them. Judge Hoffman studied Thomas for a long moment. An interesting perspective, Mr. Johnson. He checked his watch. We'll take a 15-minute recess, after which I'd like to hear final arguments from both sides. As the judge stood to leave, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Thomas returned to his seat, aware that Wilson was watching him with a mixture of anger and, surprisingly, respect. During the recess, the hallway outside courtroom 12 buzzed with conversation. Community members approached Thomas with words of encouragement. A local reporter scribbled notes, clearly captivated by the unfolding drama. Ava squeezed through the crowd to reach Thomas. You're doing amazingly, she whispered. But Wilson's team is huddled in the corner looking like they're planning something. Be ready. Thomas nodded, taking a sip from a water bottle. They can't change the facts. The law is on our side. Meanwhile, across the hallway, Wilson was engaged in an intense discussion with his attorneys. Their frustrated gestures suggested disagreement. At one point, Wilson seemed to overrule his legal team, pointing a finger emphatically. When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. Judge Hoffman returned to his bench, his expression even more serious than before. Before we continue with final arguments, Mr. Peterson, I understand you have a matter to address? Wilson's attorney stood. Yes, Your Honor. After careful consideration, my client would like to propose a settlement. Thomas straightened in his chair, surprised by this sudden change. In the interest of community goodwill, Peterson continued, Wilson Development is prepared to offer Mr. Johnson a new 10-year lease at his current rate, with an option to renew. Additionally, they will establish a community development fund of $500,000 to benefit local businesses in the neighborhood. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The offer was unexpectedly generous. Judge Hoffman turned to Thomas. Mr. Johnson? Your thoughts on this proposal? Thomas stood slowly, aware that all eyes were on him. The offer was tempting, better than he could have hoped for if he won the case outright. But something felt wrong. Your Honor, may I ask a question of Mr. Wilson directly? The judge hesitated, then nodded. Unusual, but I'll allow it. Thomas faced the developer. Mr. Wilson, does this settlement include similar protections for other businesses in the neighborhood? Or just my bookstore? Wilson shifted uncomfortably before standing. This offer applies specifically to your situation, Mr. Johnson. And the rest of the community? Mrs. Diaz's bakery? The family-owned hardware store? The daycare center? Those are separate business relationships, Wilson replied stiffly. Thomas turned back to the judge. Your Honor, while I appreciate the offer, I must decline. This case has never been just about my bookstore. The evidence shows a pattern of deliberate displacement targeting an entire community. A hushed silence fell over the courtroom. Even Judge Hoffman seemed taken aback. Mr. Johnson, the judge said carefully, you understand that if you decline this settlement, the court's ruling might not be as favorable? I do, Your Honor, Thomas replied. But sometimes principles matter more than personal gain. Wilson stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. We're offering a more than generous solution. Judge Hoffman banged his gavel. Mr. Wilson. You will be seated and remain silent unless addressed by this court. The developer sat down, face flushed with anger. Very well, the judge continued. Since the settlement has been rejected, we will proceed with final arguments. He looked at Thomas with what appeared to be newfound respect. Mr. Johnson, as the responding party, you may go first. Thomas took a deep breath. This was the moment everything had been building toward. He had risked everything by refusing the settlement. Now he needed to make his final argument count. Thomas moved to the center of the courtroom, aware of the weight of the moment. He hadn't prepared for this specific situation. Rejecting a seemingly generous offer had changed the dynamics completely. Your Honor, he began, this case began as a simple eviction dispute. But the evidence we've presented reveals something far more troubling, a systematic attempt to dismantle a community for profit. He gestured toward the gallery where his neighbors sat. The people in this courtroom aren't just spectators. They're families who have lived here for generations. Small business owners who serve local needs. Children who depend on safe, familiar places. Thomas turned to face Wilson directly. Mr. Wilson's company isn't just buying buildings, they're buying the right to erase history. To replace community spaces with luxury developments most current residents could never afford. He returned his attention to the judge. Your Honor, the legal issues here are clear. The addendum to my lease is valid. No proper notice was given before eviction proceedings began. These facts alone should resolve this case in my favor. Thomas paused, gathering his thoughts. But I ask the court to consider the broader implications. The leaked emails show that Wilson Development targeted my bookstore specifically because it serves as a community hub. They knew that if they could remove me, the heart of local resistance would be gone. Judge Hoffman leaned forward. Mr. Johnson, while I appreciate the social context, I must rule based on the law. I understand, Your Honor, Thomas replied. And that's precisely my point. The law exists to protect all citizens equally, not just those with wealth and power. When statutory requirements for eviction are ignored, when due process is bypassed, the law itself is undermined. He walked to his table and lifted a tattered book. This is the first law book I ever purchased, at a garage sale when I was 16. Inside, a former judge had written, the law, at its best, is the great equalizer. I've always believed that. Thomas's voice grew stronger. Today, I'm asking this court to affirm that belief. To show that following proper legal procedure isn't optional, even for wealthy developers. To demonstrate that our justice system can't be circumvented through backdoor deals or financial pressure. He gestured to the settlement offer. Mr. Wilson offered to protect my business while continuing to displace my neighbors. That's not justice, it's an attempt to silence legitimate opposition through selective accommodation. Thomas looked directly at Judge Hoffman. Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm simply asking for equal application of the law. The evidence shows clear violations of proper procedure and tenant rights. The eviction notice was legally insufficient. The lease addendum was valid but ignored. He took a breath before delivering his final point. If the law means anything, it must mean that everyone plays by the same rules, regardless of their wealth, power, or connections. That's all I'm asking for today, equal justice under law. Thomas returned to his seat amid complete silence. Even Wilson's attorneys seemed affected by his words. Mrs. Diaz wiped tears from her eyes. Ava squeezed Thomas's arm in silent support. Judge Hoffman's expression remained unreadable as he turned to the plaintiff's table. Mr. Peterson, your final argument? Wilson's attorney rose slowly, the confidence from earlier hearings notably absent. Whatever he said now would have to follow Thomas's powerful appeal to justice itself. Wilson's attorney approached the center of the courtroom with considerably less confidence than during previous hearings. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. Your Honor, while Mr. Johnson's speech was certainly moving, this case must be decided on legal grounds, not emotional appeals. His voice lacked conviction. The fact remains that the property now belongs to my client, who has the right to determine its best use. Judge Hoffman interrupted. Mr. Peterson, are you disputing the validity of the lease addendum? We question its enforceability given the change in ownership. On what legal basis? The judge's tone was sharp. Property transfers include existing legal obligations. That's basic contract law. Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, even if the addendum is valid, my client has legitimate business interests that do not override statutory requirements, Judge Hoffman finished for him. The law requires written notice before eviction proceedings. Did your client provide such notice? No, Your Honor, but... There is no but in this instance, Counselor. The judge's patience was clearly wearing thin. The law exists for a reason. Peterson attempted to recover. We believe the court should consider the economic benefits our development would bring to the broader city, including increased tax revenue and job creation. The argument fell flat in the silent courtroom. After a few more minutes of increasingly desperate legal reasoning, Peterson concluded and returned to his seat. Wilson stared straight ahead, his expression stony. Judge Hoffman studied his notes for several long moments. The courtroom remained completely silent as everyone awaited his decision. In most cases, the judge finally began, or would take this matter under advisement and issue a written ruling. However, the facts here are sufficiently clear that I believe an immediate decision is appropriate. He looked directly at Thomas. Mr. Johnson, when you first appeared in my courtroom, I made assumptions about your legal knowledge based on irrelevant factors. I was incorrect, and I acknowledge that error. The judge turned to Wilson. Mr. Wilson, your company failed to follow proper legal procedures in attempting to evict the defendant. The lease addendum is valid and binding. The lack of proper written notice is a fatal flaw in your case. Judge Hoffman straightened in his chair. Therefore, this court rules in favor of the defendant. The eviction proceedings are dismissed with prejudice. He banged his gavel decisively. Furthermore, I am ordering Wilson Development to pay Mr. Johnson's court costs and to honor the terms of his lease, including the addendum, for its full duration. The courtroom erupted. Community members embraced each other. Mrs. Diaz wiped away tears of joy. Ava squeezed Thomas's shoulder in congratulation. As Thomas gathered his documents, Wilson approached him, his attorneys trailing behind looking defeated. You're a formidable opponent, Mr. Johnson, Wilson said, offering his hand. I underestimated you. Thomas hesitated before shaking it. This wasn't about winning or losing, Mr. Wilson. It was about fairness. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps we should talk, not about buying your property, but about how my company might better engage with communities. I'd be open to that conversation, Thomas replied, surprising himself. Change often began in unexpected ways. Outside the courthouse, the scene resembled a block party more than a legal proceeding. Community members hugged and cheered, relief evident on their faces. Several local news outlets had gathered, and Thomas found himself surrounded by microphones and cameras. "How does it feel to win against such a powerful opponent?" one reporter asked. Thomas considered his answer carefully. "This victory isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who believes in community and justice. But the real work begins now, ensuring that all neighborhoods have the legal resources to defend themselves." Later that evening, the bookstore hosted an impromptu celebration. People brought food and drinks, sharing stories and laughter. The space that Thomas had fought so hard to preserve was fulfilling its purpose as a community gathering place. Ava pulled him aside during the festivities. "You know, this case is going to be discussed in my law school classes for years to come." She smiled. "But I was thinking, have you ever considered finishing your law degree?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "It's been on my mind, especially these past few weeks. The dean of my law school was following your case. She mentioned scholarship opportunities for non-traditional students with demonstrated legal aptitude." Ava grinned. Her words, not mine. Before Thomas could respond, there was a knock at the door. Judge Hoffman stood in the entrance, looking somewhat out of place in the casual celebration. The room quieted as Thomas approached him. "Your Honor, this is unexpected." The judge nodded. "I won't stay long. I just wanted to say that in 20 years on the bench, I've rarely seen such a clear demonstration of what the law is meant to be." He offered his hand. "You reminded me why I became a judge in the first place." After the judge departed, Thomas found himself standing alone near the children's reading corner. A young girl approached him with a book in her hands. "Mr. Thomas, will you still have story time on Saturdays?" she asked, her expression serious. He knelt down to her level. "Every Saturday." "That's a promise." Over the following months, Thomas's victory rippled outward. Wilson Development, facing public pressure and the possibility of similar cases, revised their approach to neighborhood development. They established a community advisory board that included Thomas and other local business owners. The local law school launched a neighborhood legal aid clinic in a vacant storefront next to the bookstore, with Thomas serving as a community liaison while pursuing his law degree part-time. And Judge Hoffman became known for his careful attention to eviction cases, frequently citing the Johnson precedent when ruling against procedurally deficient filings. As Thomas shelved books one evening, he noticed the worn law book that had inspired his courtroom speech. He opened it to the handwritten inscription about the law being the great equalizer. Beneath it, he added his own note: "The law is only as just as those brave enough to stand up for it." He smiled and returned the book to its place of honor behind the counter, a reminder of how one person's stand for justice could change not just a case, but a community.